Okay, so today we're going to talk about units 4 and 5 of the DPSI exam. Uh, these are basically the written units of the exam. So you might remember that the exam is divided into two halves, so to speak. So the first half is made up of units 1, 2, and 3, which are the oral units, and the second half is made up of units 4 and 5, which are the written units. Okay, you do these on two separate days, and the written units basically consist of two written translations. So we're going to talk a little bit about these units, and we're going to talk a little bit about how to approach these. Um, Before we do that, I quite often find it's a little bit helpful for some students to talk a little bit about what it is that we're trying to achieve when we do translation work or public service translation, especially for people that have never done any written translation before, and also for people who have done translation before or who have studied translation but haven't necessarily done a lot of public service translation, because the way you approach the type of texts that you get in public service translation might be a little bit different from the way you would approach other types of translation. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay. We'll also talk a little bit about non-equivalence, which we've already talked about in this course at length, but we're going to revisit some specific examples, in relation to these. So first of all, this first thing here, public service translation model. So uh, what this basically is it's basically just a framework that I like to kind of get students to think about in order to kind of help you understand what it is we're trying to do. So sometimes we do an exercise in the class where we get people to basically think about different elements that make up a message, and it could be any type of message. It could be a written message, a spoken message, any type of message. There's many elements that work together to create a message. And sometimes you get people to think about and kind of contribute to kind of make up a list of these elements. But just now I'll just show you some of the elements that I kind of thought about earlier. First of all, the register. So the register is basically the tone, the level of formality that message is conveyed in, whether it's a formal message, whether it's an informal message, whether it uses a specific register like legalese, for example, if it's a legal text and it's written in specific kind of jargon or style. We quite often get these, for example, in court. So when interpreters go to court, um, people in court tend to speak in a slightly formal register, but it isn't just formal. It has its own peculiarities, which I would argue, create an actual specific register. They use odd grammatical structures that you normally wouldn't do in real life. Some of these have evolved from kind of archaic English. Some of them haven't. They're just odd. They use odd expressions, odd words with meanings that we wouldn't in real life, but in that context they mean certain things. So it's its own register. So basically that's what register is, just really the tone or the level of formality of a verbal message or of a written message, of any type of message. The style of the message, or if we're talking about written translation, the style of the text. This is, yeah, I like to put these side to side because in my view, I mean, they are kind of connected to each other, but they aren't the same thing. So style would be more something that makes, in the case of a written translation, that makes uh, a text unique from and different from other texts. So we might have different texts which are all formal, but this one might be written in a certain way that distinguishes it from these other ones. And you get that quite a lot in literature, where you get some writers who've got a very distinctive way of writing, and once you pick up a book, if you don't know who wrote it, you open it and oh right, yeah, this text is definitely written by um, Saramago or Terry Pratchett, are writers I like to mention because they've got very distinctive styles. But there are many others who've got their own kind of unique style or way of writing. Syntax, so the way words are placed within sentences to form meaning. Um, so quite often this conforms to to certain rules depending on the language, but certainly the way words are ordered within the sentence do make do come do change the message. And for example, in English, if if we want to ask a question, normally we have to change the word order. In other languages you don't, but in English we usually do. um, so that would be important. That's another element that makes up the message. The grammar itself, obviously, how you actually structure not only the sentences but how you decline verbs, and whether you use personal pronouns or not, articles, prepositions, and so on and so forth. um, the words themselves, so obviously words are very important to a message, because without words it is still possible to convey messages in many different ways, but normally um, the type of messages that we're dealing with as interpreters and translators are normally spoken or written messages that use words. They don't just rely on other things like body language. I haven't really included a lot of other things. This is not an exhaustive list, and there's other things that could be here. For example, body language. I suppose context. Yeah, the context in which something is given. Um, 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 Meaning is another one. Meaning is a more abstract one, but it's one that I like to put here for a couple of reasons. But the first one being that words are complex things, and sorry, languages are complex things, and the way that the words, the grammar, the syntax work together, the register, um, can be quite subjective. Even in some languages that are kind of got more kind of strict rules uh, in this regard, as we were discussing earlier. You know, words can still, or sentences, or things that are said or written can still assume subjective meanings. Okay. So meaning is another, I would say, another element to a message. And like I said, there's many others we could carry on, but for the sake of what we're trying to talk about, this list will do for now. Yeah, but there could be many other elements, like the medium, for example, in which a message is conveyed, body language, non-verbal language, I suppose, not just body language, um, and so on and so forth. Maybe the cultural background as well, cultural setting, and so on. Yeah, it doesn't really matter for now. And now here, so we've got a small list here which we're going to use as an example. And here we've got these elements arranged in the form of a diagram. I don't know if you guys can see clearly, but basically what we've got here is the word meaning here in a central position. And we've got the other elements that we talked about here kind of round about it. And these are arrows. I don't know if you can see clearly, but these are arrows pointing towards meaning. And what is this supposed to exemplify is that all of these uh, elements, they are important. They are elements that constitute a message. And there are others, as we discussed. However, for us as public service translators, the one that assumes key relevance is this one, is meaning. Okay. And basically, what this means is that when we translate or when we interpret in the context of public services, normally this is the elements that we focus on first and foremost. Okay, so when we approach a written text or a site translation in real life or in the exam, this is our first and foremost consideration. It's getting these right, is getting the meaning across from one language into the other. These elements are important, but they're only important insofar as they contribute towards meaning. And that's why they've got a little arrow here. So it's not to say that we can ignore that. It's not to say that we can ignore register or the style or the syntax or the grammar or the words or the conventions or the body language or the medium or whatever. They might assume more or less relevance, but they're only important insofar as they contribute towards meaning. Now, this is specific. We're talking here specifically about public service translation, and this is important to realize because other types of translations might follow different rules. So, a good example is, for example, uh, poetry. If you're translating poetry, if you're translating, or if you're translating some haiku from Japanese into English, yeah, they follow a very rigid structure. It has to be that structure, otherwise it's not a haiku. Okay, so in that case, we could maybe add another one here: structure, uh, uh, or style, I suppose. That would assume key relevance, and meaning might actually come second to that. Okay, or if you're translating a novel from, I don't know, Terry Pratchett. We mentioned Terry Pratchett earlier. If you're translating a Terry Pratchett novel, focusing solely on meaning, by focusing solely on meaning, you're probably not going to do a good job, and the publisher is not going to be very happy, and you might not get paid. You would certainly have to focus on style, because that's one of the things that makes him really famous. Yeah, and you'd probably, that would be one, maybe your key consideration, for that type of translation. Same thing, marketing translations. I think we've talked about some of these examples before. Marketing translation, once again, style is very important. you know and you do see sometimes slogans changed completely from language to language, sometimes even brands. So the, long story short, this can vary depending on the type of translation that you're doing. But for our purposes, for sites, not for sites, sorry, for public service translation, generally speaking, and we're talking in general terms. Obviously, this is not, a rigid rule. Um, Generally speaking, in most instances, in the vast majority of cases, we focus first and foremost on meaning. Okay, because the type of translation we're doing, the type of interpreting we're doing, serves a very practical purpose. So we have to stay true to that purpose and focus on that purpose first. And yes, the register, in other words, the level of formality, it can be important, but only insofar as it helps contribute towards meaning. So I'll give you an example. Let's imagine we're in court. You're a court interpreter. Okay, I know, in the session when I'm recording these, obviously everybody's doing the health option, but let's imagine, for the sake of an example, some of you also do court interpreting. Let's imagine you're interpreting in court, and I'm using this example because everybody knows that in court they tend to speak in kind of, a slightly formal manner. Yeah, is it important that the court interpreter uses an equally formal register? Um, no, it isn't. And I know some people would dispute that, but there's actually case law that says that no, that's not important. It's not important. What's important is the meaning. The reason why that interpreter is there is for the court to discharge its duties under Article 6 of the of the European Convention on Human Rights. In other words, so that the client understands what is going on. It's not for the client to get a sense of the level of formality of the language that's being used. It doesn't say that. It's for the client to understand what's being said. So what's really important for the interpreter is to make sure they get the meaning across. If they don't get the register across, it doesn't matter, as long as they get the meaning across. Okay, and in the DPSI law, we're going to look at some cases to kind of to deepen these. But same thing for the students preparing for the health option. Um, you know, uh, you've got a surgery consent form. Yeah, you've got a patient who's going for the surgery, and you've got a consent form, and it's written in very technical terms. So, they might have, they might have some very kind of technical or scientific terms for some illnesses or conditions, and they're asking the patient, do you have these, do you have that? And I mean, and then the question is, do I use more formal language in my language as well to convey that, or do I make sure that the patient understands what they're talking about? I would argue that what's important is that the patient understands so they can answer the questions in the form accurately for their own well-being, because that's the whole point of the form. It's not to humiliate the patient, and it's not to make the patient feel more anxious than he or she already is to basically get an accurate response for those questions for the patient's well-being. Okay, so if that means that instead of using more scientific or formal language, you have to use more informal language to get that message across, that is not only totally acceptable, as it is advisable. That's what you should do, because we're focusing on the meaning, we're not focusing on the register. Okay, so as public service interpreters and translators, that's normally what we do. We focus on these. Okay, and a good example that normally used to kind of get this message across is how you translate idioms. So if you're, once again, if you're a literary translator, you might want to approach these, or if you're doing marketing translation, you might want to approach these in a different way. You might have to approach these in a different way. But as far as public service interpreting is concerned, our job is a very practical one. So um, if a police officer tells if you've got two police officers and one of them says to the guy at the police station, I'm sick of you, I'm going to lock you up and throw away the key. Which they won't, they shouldn't, because they'll get in trouble if they do. But anyway, let's imagine they say that and the other officer says, oh, he's just pulling your leg, don't worry about it. Because maybe he's a more senior officer and he realizes that his junior colleague is going to get in trouble for that. He's like, oh, no, it's okay, he's just pulling your leg. How would you translate that? Would you say, oh, he's pulling your leg? Or would you start scratching your head and try and think of an equivalent idiom? No, it's not relevant. It's not important. What's important is that a client realizes that he's just teasing you, he's just having a laugh, or he's just saying something slightly inappropriate in that particular example. Um, uh, Same thing for these other idioms. Would you translate them literally, or would you focus on the meaning? And as public service interpreters and translators, we would focus on the meaning of what they're trying to say, because that's what's important for us. Okay. Uh, and all of this to say that translation is not about words, it is about meaning. So that's really the main point of this kind of model, um, is to kind of help you understand this if you haven't done translation before. For people who have never done translation and they're doing this for the same time, it's quite easy to get sometimes too hung up on words. Oh, the text uses these words, so I'm really not sure how to deal with it. Well, sometimes it's not. Sometimes that word is not that important, or is not that relevant, or it doesn't mean that sometimes you might be able to rephrase things to avoid that word you're struggling with. So remember that words are just one of the elements that contributes towards meaning, and that's what you focus on, and that should give you a lot more freedom on how you approach the translation of certain things. Like here, for example, is the word blue important? No. What's important is the meaning of this idiom. I'm feeling blue, I'm feeling a bit depressed. This happens a lot. They use these so if you do postnatal appointments, for example, some of you will do this a lot. Someone has a baby, after a day or sometimes a couple of days, they're discharged, they go home, and then they get a follow-up appointment by a midwife. So a midwife goes up, and they've got a list of things that check with the baby. So they weigh the baby, they measure the baby, they do some tests for vision, for sight, all this stuff to check on the welfare of the baby, but they also check on the welfare of the mom. Yeah, so the health visitors, they're also for the mother. And the question they quite often, and health visitors, they tend to, not just health visitors, health workers in general, they tend to use a lot of kind of common colloquial idioms. And one of them that they ask quite often, in this case, is they will ask the mum, how you feeling? They always ask, how you been coping, how you feeling? Have you got the baby blues? Yeah, they'll ask her, have you got the baby blues? They're not talking about blues music, and they're not talking about the color blue. They're just asking her, do you feel a bit depressed? Do you feel a bit down? Do you feel, sad? That's basically, that's 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 the meaning of that sentence, and that's the reason why that midwife is asking that sentence. That's what she wants to know. She wants to know whether the mom is feeling a little bit depressed or stressed, or in any other way not normal, because if she is, she might need extra support. So as an interpreter, should you really focus, think too much, overthink that, and maybe try and find an equivalent idiom? No, it's not relevant. It's not important. What's important is that we get the meaning of that message across, so that healthcare worker gets a meaningful response, so that she can provide the level of care that that patient needs. That's what's important for a public service interpreter, is not to show off our knowledge of idioms. So what are we looking for in translation? When we approach a written translation text, we're trying to produce a text that reads as if it had originally been written in the target language. Okay, so we're going to translate something from, for example, English into Spanish, and we want that the final Spanish text, when a Spanish client gets that text, they're not going to think, "Oh, this has been translated from English." No, they want them to read it and not even think that it's a translation, because it's so elegantly and beautifully written, and it gets the message across, in a practical and efficient manner. So, in order to do this, you have to think about a few different things like conventions, of the target language. We'll talk more about these in a minute. Grammar and syntax. So, you know, we were talking earlier about how English is a very flexible language, but some other languages aren't. In some languages the verb always comes at the end, or in some languages the direct object is always before the indirect object, or in some languages, you always need an explicit subject. You need some sort of personal pronoun or a name. In some languages we don't. In Portuguese, for example, you can omit the subject of a sentence if it's obvious. If I want cheese, I will just say quero queijo, and literally translated that means want cheese. Okay, I don't need the personal pronoun I, or my name João. I don't need to say eu quero queijo, I want cheese. I don't need to say that in Portuguese, because the form of the verb tells the listener who it is that I'm talking about. Okay, that's a convention in Portuguese. So if I'm translating the sentence quero queijo, want cheese, into English, I wouldn't just translate it as want cheese, because, because that would make me sound like a caveman. I would translate it as I want cheese, because in English you do need, some sort of personal pronoun there, or some sort of subject there for the sentence to make meaning. Otherwise, I don't know who wants cheese. Wants cheese? Who wants cheese? What wants cheese? Yeah. So that's what I'm trying to explain here. You obviously need to respect the conventions of the target language, and terminology as well. Obviously, that's important, and especially for the type of texts that we're dealing with. Um, an example here. So let's imagine that you are translating a patient information leaflet, and you get this kind of formula a lot in NHS information leaflets. Yeah. Normally in this course, we give students lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots, dozens of different information leaflets, and you see this quite a lot. In this online course, you'll probably be encountering mostly also some leaflets that will give you in PDF form, but also other types of texts. But especially when you look at the kind of information leaflets that you work with in real life, that are given to patients, and you quite often asked to translate it quickly for a patient, as we discussed before, without any time to prepare. You just kind of need to jump in and do it, because that GP only has 10 minutes to see that patient, or 20 minutes at the most. But in Glasgow, for example, most appointments these days are 10-minute appointments. Or you go to a hospital, and the same thing, they may be under a lot of pressure, and they're, the clock is ticking, and they really just want to deal with that patient as quickly as possible and get him out, see the next one. So anyway, let's imagine you get a leaflet, and there's this sentence: you'll be able to see a physician, which is another word for doctor. Yeah, and you do see these a lot, even on the NHS website. You see these a lot. um, and we'll talk another session why it's quite interesting. But we'll talk in another session why this is. But suffice to say, you get this a lot. Yeah. Um, as a translator, as an interpreter, how do you approach this sentence? I mean, for me, for example, in Portuguese, in my language, we only have one word for doctor. A doctor is a doctor. It's médico. Now, if I use the word médico, which is literally doctor, for that doctor, then how the hell do I convey physician? And this creates suddenly a linguistic dilemma for me. But it's a dilemma that I shouldn't even have, because what I'm trying to, as I explained before, what we're focusing on is the meaning. And what this sentence is saying is that you will be able to see a doctor. Okay, so as a public service interpreter, that's what I say. You will be able to see a doctor. That's the full translation for me of this sentence. The fact that there's two different words in English for doctor in the source is neither here nor there. It's irrelevant, it's not important. Why is this here? This is here for clarity. And you get this a lot, as I said, in NHS leaflets. You get it a lot, for example, for um, leaflets about medical conditions, where they might have a more scientific name for a condition and then a more colloquial name. Okay, to make sure that the reader understands. Okay, um, so it's there just for clarity, and as a translator, you have to decide whether that's important or not in your translation. And 2 weeks ago, we were talking about non-equivalence. And here is an example of a problem of non-equivalence. And one approach, a very, very valid approach, which I'm not sure we discussed last time, but one valid approach that translators and interpreters use a lot, is translation by omission. Okay, this is my favorite type of strategy to deal with non-equivalence: translation by omission. And that really just means that you translate by omitting part of the text. In other words, by ignoring part of the text. Now, I'm not saying that that's certainly something you should do in all instances. I'm not saying that that's something you should do all the time. I am not saying that that should be your first approach, your first choice, but it is a valid approach in some cases. And in some cases, it is the best approach. And I would argue that in this case, for the context in which this sentence will be used, it is the best approach. You will be able to see a doctor. Simple. Okay, there's no point confusing the patient. Think about the context in which the sentence will be used and the purpose that the sentence serves. Okay, we have to understand the message in order to be able to translate the message. Okay, ultimately, this is crucial, because we're focusing on the meaning. We're not focusing on the words, and it's quite when students are struggling with a text, for example, in an exam, it is everybody's natural reaction to then revert to word for word translation, because you don't really understand what the text is trying to say. So you then just start converting the words into into the other language, and you end up with sentences that mean gobbledygook. They don't mean anything. um, you see this a lot as well, sometimes in scientific journals, in abstracts, for example, because you'll just get some, you've got a guy who's, I don't know, a physician, and he's published a paper on something, and the abstract's always translated into English. So then they'll get, maybe he'll do it himself because he speaks a little bit of English. He'll get a colleague in the lab or whatever, to translate it for him or for her. And these people aren't translators. And you quite often, reading these scientific abstracts can be hilarious, because quite often you end up with things that just make absolutely no sense in English, and they actually, to the detriment of that paper, rather than to than serving the purpose that it's intended to serve. So Moving on, how to deal with non-equivalence. So there is some types of non-equivalence that we tend to get in the paper, you know, quite frequently. Um, One of these are acronyms and abbreviations. You should say acronyms and abbreviations. I forgot to amend that, but yeah, when I say acronyms here, I'm also talking about abbreviations. What's the difference between the two? They are the same thing. So an abbreviation is just, sorry, an acronym is just an abbreviation that's read out as a word, whereas an abbreviation is read out as a series of letters. Okay, so National Health Service, NHS. So that's an abbreviation because it's not pronounced NS, it's pronounced NHS. You pronounce the letters, yeah. So that's an abbreviation. An acronym would be something like um uh, can't think of any. NASA. Someone mentioned the other day the NASA, North American Space Agency, is not the best example because it doesn't relate to health, but it doesn't matter. You pronounce it as a word. You don't pronounce NASA. You pronounce it as NASA. Yeah, so that's an acronym because it's pronounced as a word. So that's the difference. But in practical terms, for us, they're the same thing, and how we deal with it, how we approach them, is the same thing. How do you translate acronyms or these abbreviations you will most likely encounter at some point in the exam or in one, either one paper or the other? Well, first rule of thumb: just because you have an acronym or abbreviation in the source language, it does not mean that you need one in the target language. Okay. So just now, for example, we in fact, I won't give you this example now. I'll give it to you in a minute. But basically, okay. So, for example, the word the abbreviation NHS. Yeah, just because you've got the abbreviation NHS there in the source, do you necessarily need it in the target? Maybe you don't. Maybe you don't. NHS stands for National Health Service. It refers to the National Health Service. So whenever people talk about the NHS, they talk about the National Health Service. So maybe you can just use the full form of what it is that you're talking about. For clarity, you could just say the National Health Service. That's what NHS stands for. Okay. The fact that an abbreviation was used in the original, in many cases, not always, but in many cases, neither here nor there. It's not that important. Okay, so you don't need to replicate, not necessarily. In some cases, it might be advisable, but in some cases, it might not. You don't necessarily need to replicate that abbreviation in the targets. Okay. Um, if there is a standardized version of the abbreviation or acronym, then use it. And this happens a lot for kind of international bodies, international organizations. Um, you know, Well-established medical conditions, things like COVID-19, for example. Um, if there's a standardized version of COVID, then use it. Don't make up your own, okay? Or PCR tests. Just now, in this last couple of weeks, everything in the media has been about PCR tests, PCR tests, PCR tests, PCR tests. Okay. If there's a standardized version of this abbreviation in your language, then use it. If there isn't, I'd suggest you probably do not create your own. Okay, because well, because you might create something that doesn't exist, something that might create confusion with something else, and ultimately, something that might create confusion, and especially for healthcare language, don't create acronyms, don't create abbreviations. Either use the full version of what that abbreviation refers to, or use the original abbreviation from the English. Okay, that would be my rule of thumb, and this is just a rule of thumb, just a general rule, and certainly the rule as far as the exam is concerned. So in real life, you might deviate from this rule somewhat, depending on the kind of text or context that you're dealing with. But as far as the exam is concerned, just keep these three rules in mind. Okay, you don't necessarily need to replicate the abbreviation or acronym. You might want to. If you do think it's more appropriate to have an abbreviation or acronym in the target text, then If you know the equivalent in your language, use it, obviously. If you don't know, just use the English one. Um, Usually explaining what it means or what it relates to if you think that's necessary. Okay. Same thing for the legal option, and also for the healthcare option. You do get the names of laws and acts appearing somewhat occasionally in the exam. So, but most so in the legal option. So, um, they will sometimes in the text mention something. For example, in the legal option, they could have about they could have a text about someone being sectioned under the Mental Health Act. Yeah. And they'll say, "Oh, you've been sectioned under the Mental Health Act, and what this means is that blah 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 blah." For example, that could be a site translation. How do you translate the names of acts or the names of laws? Um, Very simple. As far as the exam is concerned, very very simple. You leave them in English, and you paraphrase them in the target language. Okay, so you would literally translate Mental Health Act into your language. Act just meaning a law, an act of parliament. So you could translate that as law, the law to do with mental health, leaving the English there. Okay. So in Portuguese, I would say something like um, Mental Health Act would be lei sobre a saúde mental or lei relativa à saúde mental, Mental Health Act. I would mention the English. Okay. You only need to do that the first time the term comes up. So if it's a term that occurs several times in the text or in the role play scenario or in the side translation, you only need to do that the first time. The second and third and subsequent times, you could just use the translated form because you've already explained what the English name is, what the original English name is. Okay. That's We won't go so much into the reasons why it's good practice to do that. But suffice it to say that for the purpose of the exam, that's what the institute says that they expect you to do. So if you don't want to get marked down, do it. Okay. You might not encounter any in the health option, but you might do. Okay. And if you do, it's very, very simple. No need to stress about it. Just leave it in English, give an explanation in your language, translate it in your language. And the name of the law, the name of the act always tells you what the act is about. The names of laws are descriptive names. Okay, so they describe what the law is about, which means that for us as translators, we just do a direct translation of that. It's very very simple to deal with. Yeah. uh, the Criminal Procedure Scotland Act, it's the law from Scotland to do with criminal procedure. The Antisocial Behavior Order Act is the law to do with antisocial behavior orders. uh, Nice and simple. Okay. um, Other terminology. So, and this happens a lot. Some Not a lot, but occasionally it can happen in the health option, um, where you get terms that might not necessarily have an equivalent in your language. So if there is an equivalent, obviously use it. And this is where building up your glossary might prove during the course might prove useful for you when it comes to the exam, because you will have that kind of hopefully big list of terms that may or may not be, hopefully will be relevant and will use in the help you in the exam. But let's imagine it's a term you've never encountered and it's a new condition. For example, PCR tests. The text is about COVID-19 and they're talking about PCR tests. um, and until very recently nobody talked about PCR tests, and you don't really know if there's an equivalent in your language or not, because it's the exam. You can't Google it. um, what do you do? Well, you just leave the term in English. Okay. And then you just paraphrase it if you need to. Okay. Be careful of over translating and be careful of under translating. So sometimes people misinterpret a little bit what I'm trying to explain when I say, "Oh, just focus on the meaning and everything else is secondary." Um, it doesn't mean that you've got full freedom to change everything and do whatever you want with the text at your own free will. It just means that these element here, meaning, is the element that you have to do your utmost not to change as much as possible. And obviously, you know as linguists, as fluent bilingual speakers, we know that that's not always possible. quite often there will be an unavoidable loss of meaning in most translations actually. But as public service interpreters and translators, we have to try and keep that to a minimal to a minimum, and we have to ensure that whatever loss of meaning there is that does not affect the ultimate purpose of that message, of that text, or of that site translation, or of that verbal translation. Yeah, so we have to do our uh, utmost to keep this the same, and these are the elements that we can change. Yeah, that we should feel free to rework as needed. Now, as needed, not just because we feel like, okay, I'm just going to speak in Glaswegian slang because I feel like it. No, that's not what I'm saying. Okay, and if you do that, you will probably get marked down in the exam. It's also not licensed to be lazy. Some people say, I'll just write whatever. It's roughly what it says, or it's how I would have said that. You're not the author. You're the translator. And I know sometimes there's a fine line between both, but we have to try and stay true to the source as much as possible. Okay, so it's not licensed to be lazy. It's not licensed to be over creative and try and show off our knowledge or our linguistic ability. As public service translators or interpreters, we really have to just try and get that message as closely as possible, and we might make a conscious decision to change the register or the style or the syntax and so on and so forth, but for the purposes of conveying the meaning, not for the purposes of whatever other agenda we might have. Okay, so that's really what I mean about over translating and under translating. It's not just licensed to be lazy or to do a half, pardon my English, a half-arsed job. Okay, um, it's not licensed to put things in the text that the text doesn't talk about, to basically convey too much meaning, things that the text doesn't really say. Um, and it's not really licensed to, I'll just ignore that because that's not really relevant to the client. He doesn't need to know that. It's not up to us to decide that. Okay, and yes, there are sometimes cases where you might do translation by omission, like I was saying before, um, but because we think as translators that that's the best approach to deal with that text, to convey that message in a practical and in an efficient manner, not just because we think that half of this text is not really relevant, so I'm just going to skip it. Okay, that's not up to us, and if you do that in the exam, you will be marked down and you will probably fail. Okay. Okay, now talking about conventions, we mentioned conventions before, and we mentioned that when you know doing written translation, we're talking about now, when translating from one language to another, the target text really has to respect the conventions of the target language. And one such convention that we have to be very aware of is letter writing conventions. A lot of the papers you get in the exam are in the format of letters, both for the written unit and for the site translation. Okay, so you really have to familiarize yourself with letter writing conventions in both languages. I'm not going to teach you about letter writing conventions in your language. That's up to you because I don't know. The odds are I might not speak your language. That's your research. That onus is on you to do that, and you should do that if you want to do well in the exam because it might be relevant. But in English, uh, as far as the exam is concerned, follow these simple rules. First of all, to open the letter, always start a formal letter with dear sir or dear madam, dear sir stroke madam, or dear, and then the person's name, Mr. Smith, Ms. Smith, Mrs. Smith, Ms. Smith, whatever, yeah, whatever the person's name is. Okay. Um, and in your language, you follow the conventions of your language. So if I had a site translation text and my site translation text started with, uh, dear uh, dear Mr. Madeira. Yeah. How would I translate that into Portuguese? I would probably translate it as Excelentíssimo Senhor Madeira. Okay, your most excellent Mr. Madeira. or if it was a more informal letter. And sometimes the letters you get in the health paper are slightly more informal than you do get in the legal paper. I might think, well, maybe it's better to just translate it as caro senhor Madeira, because excelentíssimo might sound a bit too formal depending on the type of document I'm dealing with. But that's basically the two uh, ways I would start in Portuguese, okay? And vice versa. So if I've got a letter in Portuguese for the exam and I have to translate it into English. And let's imagine it starts with excelentíssimo. And excelentíssimo in English just means you're most excellent. You're most excellent, Mr. Madeira. Okay. Would I translate that literally into English as your most excellent, Mr. Madeira? No, I wouldn't, because the examiner would mark me down. I would translate it as dear Mr. Madeira, which sounds more informal in English, but it serves the same purpose. And that's how you start a formal letter in English. It does sound informal, but it's not necessarily. It can also be used in formal language. Okay, so whatever form it has in both languages, it's irrelevant. Just make sure you know it, okay, and then use it accordingly. Okay, so for English, always always dear something, yeah, and then you always close the formal letter with yours faithfully or yours sincerely in English, yeah. Never anything else. Never faithfully yours or sincerely yours or kind regards or um, all the best or I don't know, whichever other way you might want to finish your letter. So always yours faithfully, always yours sincerely for the purposes of the exam. Okay, and these are not interchangeable. So I've made a wee note here. So yours faithfully if you did not address the letter to a specific person. So if you just addressed it to dear sir, in other words, there's no name at the start of the letter, then you would finish with yours faithfully. And if you addressed it to Mr. Smith or a specific, you named a person here, then you'd finish with yours sincerely because you addressed it to a specific person. Okay, so you've got an example here. So, dear sir, faithfully, dear Mr. Madeira, yours sincerely. Okay, so you can make a note of these in your dictionary so you don't mess it up for the exam, for the written exam. If you get it in the site translation, you might get it in the site translation. um, it does it, the site translations are quite often in the form of letters. So I would memorize this rule, and there's a couple of ways that people so a couple of mnemonics that people use. I mean, one of them is that two s's don't go together. So if you've got sincerely here, you can't have a sir. It has to be a Mr. or Ms. something. uh, this is not a great example because this starts with Smith. The actual name starts with Smith, but that's ignoring, as long as you remember that the rule relates to Sir sincerely. Yeah. And uh, my another way is this is the way I remember, is you're faithful to someone you don't know. Okay, so it's the opposite of what makes sense to me. That rule works for me. It's the opposite of what makes sense. So I'm faithful to someone I don't know. Okay, whereas I should be faithful to someone I know. It's the opposite. For me, that works. You might come up with your own mnemonic, your own way of kind of remembering these, but you just yeah, you should try and get it right. And if you get to the site translation and you can't remember which one is correct, okay, just remember what we talked about. It choose one and say it confidently, because the examiner might not even notice. Okay, the examiner might not even know. They might not even know. And in a lot of cases, they don't. Okay, I can tell you these with 100% certainty, that in a lot of cases, the examiners don't know, but they might do. And if they do, they'll mark you down if you get it wrong. So it's good to try and get it right. Um, but if you don't know which one it is, just choose one and say it confidently. But don't say anything else, because if you say something else, kind regards, best regards, they will probably know, that sounds a bit informal. That's not really appropriate. But if you say yours sincerely instead of yours faithfully, you might get away with it. Not so much for the written translation. In the written translation, make a note of it in your glossary, in your dictionary. Make sure you get it right. It's wasted points if you get it wrong. Okay, and you might need every mark to pass, and if you do, you'd be really crap to fail the exam because you got these wrong. That would be really depressing, I think. Um, Moving on, dictionaries. Dictionaries are your best friends. For the written unit, you are allowed to take dictionaries and glossaries into the exam. Okay, you are allowed, not into the other units, but you are allowed to use them for these units. You are allowed to take as many dictionaries and glossaries as you want with you. And we do get students that, when they do the physical exam, they came in with suitcases. That's absolutely fine. Okay, that's absolutely fine. Um, Obviously, there's a, a practical element to it. And if you do go to a center to sit your exam, you know, there's no point bringing a truckload of exams. A small suitcase is fine. A small suitcase is fine, because your table might only be so big. And sometimes you do have students who've got dictionaries on the table, under the table, and so that's fine. Whatever works with you. But just common sense, I suppose. Um, a professional translator will never work with just one dictionary or source of reference material. In these days, most professional translators don't work with any physical dictionaries. They use digital and online dictionaries, but we can't for the exam, so there's no point crying about it. It is what it is. We just have to do our best. But basically, what I'm trying to say here is, um, it's really not great to just go into the exam room with a little dictionary, and maybe all you own is a little pocket dictionary, so you just take this little pocket dictionary, and then you get the word physician. What's a physician? I think it's a doctor, but I'm not sure. Could it mean something else? I'm going to look in my. Oh, it's not here. Oh, damn it! It's not my dictionary. What do I do now? So, so it is good practice to take more than one dictionary if you can, if you own them. Obviously, if you don't own them, you don't own them. Um, uh, but it's better to have more dictionaries and not need them than need a dictionary not have it. So, but obviously, it's up to you. And familiarize yourself with the dictionaries you'll be using during the exam. So, I quite often say to students, one of the things you can do for the exam is that you can, if you don't own any dictionaries or if you don't own any recent dictionaries, because dictionaries are updated very irregularly because obviously languages evolve very quickly. And a dictionary from 2019, for example, will not have the word shielding in it. They won't have the word social distancing, face covering. They won't have any of these expressions in them because in 2019 these expressions didn't exist. Okay, so and this is just an example of how quickly languages can evolve. And now we're in February 2021, and these words are common day usage. And I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't get a paper in the exam about COVID-19, for example. And let's imagine you've been maybe trying to not watch the media and the news so you don't get stressed about COVID, but then in the exam you have to deal with COVID, so you don't know what these terms mean and you don't know how to translate them. Yeah, and you pick your dictionary. If it's an old dictionary, it's not going to be there. So try and get recent editions. I know dictionaries can be expensive, and I would never recommend that you spend a lot of money on dictionaries, especially if you can't afford it, because it might be a case of something you use once and never again. Um, there's different places you can find dictionaries, and we can talk a little bit more about these later on in the course. But you might want to borrow them off libraries. If you do, once again, try to borrow recent editions if you can. Quite often, local libraries don't have recent editions; they tend to have kind of older editions, but that's better than nothing, I suppose. um, Bear in mind that sometimes you might need, when you go to get your dictionary for the exam, it might not be there, someone else might have borrowed it. Or sometimes libraries don't lend out reference materials, so it might be useful to find out if your local library what they do have and whether they do lend it out. Another trick you can do is order dictionaries on Amazon. uh, Making sure that you order directly from Amazon and not a third party seller. But if you do order directly from Amazon, then you can order it, use it in the exam, and then return it to get your full money back. Okay, as long as you don't damage the dictionary, obviously. That's absolutely fine. It's not illegal. It's not against the rules. It's Amazon's rules. It's their policy. They're very, very clear in their policy that the policy is you can return books that you've bought for whatever reason. It says there on their policy, whatever reason. Okay, no questions asked. and whatever reason includes using it in the exam and then returning it if you want. So that's something you can do, but obviously if you're going to use that approach, and I have done that before when I had to do translation tests for the European Commission. The only Portuguese English dictionary I had was the same one that I used to use when I was at school learning English. It was a bit old. It was a bit old, and so I had to buy three new dictionaries, and dictionaries aren't cheap. So the cheapest one I think cost me £60, and 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 so I bought them, and then I actually decided to keep one of them because I thought, you know what, I actually quite like this dictionary. I'm going to keep it. But the others I returned them because I had no intention of ever using them again, and it was a lot of money. So I used them for my exam and then I returned them. So you can do the same, but obviously kind of do a little bit of research in advance to see whether they will be available to you and kind of look at the return policy, how long you've got to return them. I think it's quite a long window you've got to return them, but it might be something that you might want to do. Bearing in mind as well, like I said, this is for books sold directly by Amazon. Sometimes if you buy a book from a third party seller on the Amazon website, the return policy might be slightly different. So make sure you and that's always quite explicit as whether it's Amazon or not selling a book. So, but if you need help to do that, and obviously you can talk about it this later on in the course and near the date. Okay, now game plan. So last week we were talking about site translation and the game plan for that. This week we're going to talk about written translation and the game plan for that. So game plan is just as important for this part of the unit as it is for the other part of the unit. Okay, it is important, it is crucial that you have a game plan, that you have a methodology, a strategy to approach the exam. Once again, this is going to be an individual way of doing things. You will find the way that works for you, hopefully through practice well before the exam. Okay, so but basically what a game plan is exactly the same thing as it is for the site translation. Basically what it means is that you should know exactly what you're doing, in what order you're doing it, when you walk into the exam room or when you connect to to the website to do your written translation. You should practice this game plan, and your game plan might be different to someone else's game plan. Okay, so it might be very specific to you. Okay, so what I've got here is just a suggestion. Once again, it's just a suggestion. It doesn't mean that you have to do things this way. It's just a suggestion of maybe somewhere to start that you can try out and see if it works, and then a suggestion that you can then tweak to according to your own style, to your own needs. Yeah. It's a 60-minute exam. If you do it online through the portal, you might get 10 minutes extra, but generally speaking, it's a 60-minute exam. And by the end of that exam, you need to produce a translation to a professional standard, which in real life would be the end product delivered to the client. This is important to realize. It's not supposed to be a half done job. It's not supposed to be a draft. It's supposed to be the final translation that you would give to the client. And my suggestion is that you follow the same 3 steps that you do in real life. So translators never just kind of translate something and send it back. Normally there's 3 steps to doing a translation. First of all, research, where you kind of research the text. Especially if it's a technical text, you might need to do some background research. You might need to go to your reference materials, your glossaries, your dictionaries, your online tools in real life, not in the exam, to research the text, to make sure you understand what the text is trying to say. Then you translate the text, and then you do some sort of quality assurance before you send the text to your client to make sure that it's as free of errors as possible. Okay, because if there's mistakes there, then the client will get annoyed. They might not pay you. They might not give you any more work in the future. So you want to have some sort of quality assurance to make sure you do a good job, to make sure not only for your pride as an interpreter, but to avoid any liability issues, and also to make sure you retain your customers. Okay. So what that means in practical terms is that for the purposes of the exam, I would suggest a 5-stage approach, roughly. Okay. Stage 1 or step 1, read the text. Just read the text. Same as site translation, same as the step 1 for that. Just read the text. Don't worry about anything else. Don't worry about picking up your dictionary. Don't worry about making notes. Just read the text. Nice and simple. 5 minutes for that. 5 minutes is generous. The text is about 350 words in length. So 5 minutes is plenty of time to read it maybe a couple of times. Yeah. When reading the text, ask yourself a couple of questions. Do you understand what the text is saying? What is the message? What is the meaning? Remember what I said before, we're going to focus on the meaning. So make sure you understand the text, because if you don't understand it, you can't translate it. As simple as that. Yeah. What is the register? What is the tone? Is it formal, informal? For example, if it's in a letter, that might affect how I start or the letter in my language in Portuguese. For example, I might say excelentíssimo paciente, or might I just say caro paciente, depending on the tone of the letter. Okay. What are the terminological difficulties? In other words, what are the words that are going to be difficult for you to translate, that are going to pose you problems when it comes to translation? What are the syntactical challenges? So same thing, does the syntax present any problems? Does the the actual way that the text is structured, in terms of sentences, present a problem for me? For example, let's imagine, giving the example I used before, let's imagine it's Portuguese into English, and because in Portuguese we quite often omit the subject in sentences just because it sounds more natural for stylistic reasons. Maybe they did that in the text, but maybe it means that the subject is actually a little bit vague in this case. I'm not quite sure. Are they talking about this patient or about patients in general, for example? Let's imagine that happens. And then, you know, what do I do as a translator? How do I approach that? Okay, and in that specific example, I don't want to leave that question open. In that specific example, well, in the context of the exam, you just have to make an informed decision and go with it. Okay, you would not give a double solution, patient, stroke, patients. You would not do that. You choose one and go with it. Okay, and I'll revisit that again later on. Step 2: research the text. Okay, so and by research the text, I mean pick your dictionary and start looking up words. So you can't use the internet, you can't use the digital materials. You just do your kind of research on your glossaries and on your dictionaries. And this is where your glossary might really come in handy. And I know that every session, I'm repeating myself, talking about the glossary, 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 build a glossary, build a glossary, build a glossary, because it is important. Obviously, it's up to you whether you do it or not. You make a decision on style, the register, the tone. Am I going to translate this in kind of slightly more formal language or more informal language? That's up to you, depending on the text. It's up to you as a translator to make a decision on that. Think about the difficult syntax and grammatical structures. Use of passive, active voice, how to deal with long sentences, how to deal with the placement of clauses, and so on and so forth. So you yeah, so basically you do all these kind of things as much as possible, and it's good practice to give yourself a time limit to do these. Yeah, for the simple reason that it's if you don't do that, quite often some people prefer to just read the text and then start translating and look up words as you go along. If you want to do that, that's absolutely fine. It's entirely up to you. I think it's not, for the purposes of the exam, it's not always in your best interest to do that, because it's harder to control how much time you spend with your nose in your dictionary when you do that. Okay, I think it's easier to know, for example, okay, this is 15 minutes, so I know that 15 minutes into the exam I have to start my translation, otherwise I'm running behind. Okay, so I've got a clear point at which I know I have to start translating. If this takes me less than 10 minutes, even better. But if it's a really difficult text, then I might have to tell myself I have to start writing. I have to start doing the translation, because otherwise I'm going to run out of time. The whole point of having a game plan is avoiding running out of time. It's purely for time management, purely. And if it's an easy text, and if you're a very experienced translator, arguably you might not even need a game plan. You might get away with not having one. Otherwise, I would strongly suggest you have one, for the simple reason I've said this 1,000 times, and I'll say it 1,000 times more. I've been invigilating exams since 2004, every single year since 2004, and in every single instance, without exception, there's been at least one. Normally, I would say almost in every single instance, more than one student running out of time in the written unit, running out of time, just not because they're bad, generally speaking, maybe in one or two cases in all these years, maybe because the student was really weak, but generally speaking, not because they were bad or were rubbish translators or they were or that they were inexperienced. It wasn't that at all. It was just time management. People just run out of time because they don't manage their time efficiently, because 60 minutes is not a lot at all, and it's easy to run out of times if you don't manage it properly. And it's really rubbish to fail the exam because if you run out of time. I mean, it's depressing for the student, and it's depressing for me as a tutor, because we're working together for months, and then I know the level of your ability, and I know you can do it, and then you run out of time in the exam. You don't even give yourself a chance of passing. Yeah, if you don't finish the translation, if you miss out, I think it's more than 5% of the text, if I'm not mistaken, then you automatically fail the unit. So you need to finish your translation no matter whether it's good or bad. You need to finish it. 5% of a 350 word text is about 17, 18 words. That's maybe about two sentences. Yeah. So between one and two sentences, depending on the size of the sentence, depending on the size of the text. So basically, if you don't translate the last sentence, there's a good chance you automatically fail the test. Okay, that's the easiest way of explaining it. So no matter what, finish the translation, whether it's good or bad. So purely for that reason, I think it's better to have this kind of time limit, knowing, okay, 50 minutes into the exam, I have to be writing. Okay, but similarly, if you start writing too early, you don't do you really understand what the text is saying? Do you know the meaning of those difficult words? Because that might affect the meaning and how you approach the text. So if you start writing too early, you might it might actually be to your detriment. Okay, so maybe having a game plan like this might help you. Okay, so anyway, 15 minutes into the exam, you start translating the text. And if you follow a game plan like this, you would have roughly 30 minutes to translate the text. And you're thinking, 30 minutes? That's not a lot. It's plenty. It's plenty. Okay, to translate the type of text, especially if you've already researched the text, you've already been thinking about it. Okay, so it's just a question of now actually putting pen to paper and starting writing down the things that you've been thinking about. Okay, uh, if you're doing it in pen and paper, we don't know if we'll be able to do the a physical pen and paper exam in June or not. But if we are, remember to write in alternate lines and do this in practice as well. Why? Because you have to. Because that's what you have to do in the exam. And basically, what does writing in alternate lines mean? Some students ask me. It just means that you write in one line, and then you do not write in the other line, and then you write in the next line, and then you do not write in the line. So in other words, you write in a line, you leave a line space, you write on another line. So you always leave a line space in between each line you use. Okay, you have to do that for the exam. If you don't, you get marked down. Okay, so and with nerves you will forget. So good to practice that way if your intention is to do a handwritten exam. Next, have a break. Okay, have a Kit Kat, have a break, 5 minute break. In real life, you do a translation, you then just let it, you just forget about it, let it lie for a while, and then you go back to it, read it again, and then send it to the clients. And really the point of the break is to really allow yourself to detach yourself from the text, because every translator suffers from tunnel vision, as I like to say. In other words, it's quite difficult sometimes to detach ourselves from the influence of the source language, and quite often to write things in a way that is natural in the target language. It becomes easier with experience and with practice, but especially if you're translating for the if you're new to translation, is quite that's quite a difficult process for some people. And it really helps if you do a translation, forget about it, then come back to it and read it, and then you realize, this doesn't sound very good in Spanish, or this doesn't sound very good in Hungarian. We don't say that. We don't say that expression. Why did I translate it that way? What was I thinking? So it's really to allow you to kind of mimic that process somewhat. It's very difficult to do in the context of the exam. And it's very difficult to do in the context of a 60-minute exam, which is not a lot. But if you play your cards right, if you have a game plan and you follow it efficiently and everything goes according to plan, which it doesn't always, but if everything goes according to plan, then you should have 5 minutes to spare to do nothing. and to think about nothing. Think about something else. Think about the soap opera, or about your kids, or the book you're reading, or what you're gonna have for dinner. Something else, yeah. Um, and that will allow you to hopefully detach yourself from the exam, so then you can go back and do the final step, which is revision and finalization. And you would, my suggestion is when you do that, start by rereading the target translation. Okay, not alongside English, just reread your target, and make sure it sounds um, correct in the target language, that it follows the conventions, that it's um, it sounds like a text that has originally been written in the target language, as we mentioned at the start. That was our ultimate objective. Ask yourself, does he meet that criteria somewhat? Then compare it with the source text to make sure you didn't miss anything out. Okay. Um, it's easy to miss out a sentence or a whole paragraph sometimes in the exam. Just with nerves, people, it's easy to skip over a sentence. It happens a lot, actually. So yeah, compare it with the source to make sure you didn't miss anything out. Okay. And remember that this is just an example of a game plan. Is just a recommendation, and this is something you might want to tweak according to your own style. A couple of areas for improvement. These are kind of just general areas for improvement. We mentioned these last time, and we're not going to focus a lot or at all in this course on these things, but it's things you might want to look at. Prepositions, use of the article, of the definite and indefinite article in English. We're talking really about English here. And the use of the simple present versus present continuous, because most people sitting the exam are non-native English speakers. Not everybody, but most people. Um, these are some of the common mistakes we see in the exam. So these are some of the areas you might want to kind of focus on. And we will do some kind of practice mock test translation, not mock test, but some practice translations that you can submit to us later on. Um, and these might be some of the things this really for the purpose of us looking at these things and see if this is one of the areas you need to improve on. Okay. Things like the use of article in English is actually quite simple, um, and straightforward. Not so much for speakers of languages that don't have articles, um, but once you learn the rule in English, it's just a question of becoming used to applying the rules. Okay. Um, and prepositions is a lot harder. This is my Achilles heel, for example, and it can be a lifelong process. But once again, if this is your Achilles heel, then might as well start working on it now to make sure you're as good as possible by the time of the exam, by the time the exam comes. Um, Same thing for simple present versus present continuous. Speakers of languages that only have one form for one verbal tense for the uh, for the present, um, uh, can struggle with when to use either. In once again, in English, there's very clear rules on when to use either. So it's just about knowing the rules and then getting used to using them. When you speak, these are things that are not very obvious when you make mistakes, especially these two, the articles and the use of the present. Um, it's quite often not very obvious that people make mistakes in these, because quite often the meaning is there anyway, but in the written units it will become very obvious to a marker that there's a mistake with an article, that there's a mistake with a verbal tense. So these are the kind of mistakes that are easy to fix, uh, and that you want to fix at this stage, so that if you're going to fail for making mistakes, it's not this type of mistake, it's other type of mistake, and hopefully you won't fail at all, you'll pass. Yeah. Top tips: if you're doing the exam with pen and paper, no draft copy. Once again, this is just a suggestion. You do whatever you want to do, whatever feels right for you. Some people really have to do a draft copy. Fine. Um, as long as, if you do a draft copy and then you decide to do a clean copy in the end, remember, I would say factor 15 minutes to do a clean copy. People think they can do a clean copy in 5 minutes. You can't. You cannot. You cannot do a clean copy of the paper in 5 minutes. Take it from me. I've seen it happen in every single examination diet. Okay, this is the main reason why people run out of time, is because they do a draft copy, and this is the suggestion. I say don't do a draft copy. Just eliminate that problem. But if you need to, fine, do a draft copy. But bear in mind that you've cut a 60-minute exam into a 45-minute exam. Okay, which is absolutely fine. But then your game plan needs to reflect that. Then you need a game plan that works within the 45 minutes. So you figure out a way that works for you. And I see many people doing draft copies and passing. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing. I'm saying, generally speaking, I would recommend avoiding it because people run out of time because they they do draft copies. As simple as that. Writing alternate lines, I've already mentioned that. If doing the exam in pen and paper, because examiners expect to see that. Examiners get annoyed when you don't do that. It doesn't mean it's an automatic fail, it's not, but you do get marked down for it. Okay. Always practice under exam conditions. Yeah. This is another problem why people run out of time in the exam, because they don't really practice with real exam constraints in their in their daily life. So it's kind of, the goalposts are different. So it's good to practice within a 60 minutes time limit. And if you do a draft copy, practice doing a clean copy and then figure out for yourself how long it takes you to do a clean copy. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe it only takes you 10 minutes, but then um, for some people it does take longer. It depends how fast you write, I suppose. um, if you do the exam online, and someone was asking about this earlier, um, then familiarize yourself with the online system. This is the link. Okay. um, you can copy and paste these onto your web browser, and it actually takes you onto a mock system. There's a mock paper there. You can just ignore that, but there's a little kind of basic browser which you can then use. It's super simple. It's super simple, but I would still recommend that you do go there and kind of see how it works. So there's one less thing to worry about on the day of the exam. Things to avoid if you're doing it in pen and paper: poor handwriting. Every single year, examiners complain about students having poor handwriting and marking down students for poor handwriting. You will be marked down for poor handwriting. So, how much or how little depends on the examiner, and it depends how poor the poor handwriting is. But generally speaking, if this is a problem for you, it's a problem for lots of people. Start practicing now, writing clearly, and bearing in mind that might use up more time in the exam as well. Avoid double solutions. I've already mentioned these. So things like these, you will be penalized for giving a double solution for a word. So in this case, we decided stroke intended to go somewhere. You either decided or you intended. Okay, you're a translator. You choose one. Don't. It's not multiple choice for the examiner. It's a final translation. Is the end product you would give a client. You wouldn't give the client an end translation with things like these. Yeah. So don't do it for the exam either. Translator's notes, we already talked about these 2 weeks ago, unless absolutely necessary. So if you think it's absolutely necessary, by all means do it. But generally speaking, you shouldn't have to do it for the DPSI. Some additional resources you might want to check. Um, uh, uh, these we'll talk a little bit more about these another time. But there's some kind of useful websites that will, that might help you for some of your languages anyway. And that's the end of today's session. Thank you very much.